Oh. Hey guys, it's Lisa with Are You My Cousin? And it is Thursday, so it's time for another YouTube Live. I keep wanting to say Facebook Live. We are on YouTube. And today I have a guest with me, Rich Venezia. Rich, did I say that right? Venezia?
Venezia, yeah.
Venezia. With my little southern accent in it. But anyway, so as we're waiting for people to come on, I just want to welcome everybody as they come. When you come in, if you don't mind giving me a thumbs up to let me know that you are seeing us well over there and hearing and everything is good, that would be really helpful. And if you want to let us know where you're from, where you're listening from, that's always fun to do. If this is your first time, as I said, I'm Lisa, and I am actually sitting in North Carolina. And Rich, where are you sitting again?
I'm in Pittsburgh, PA.
Pittsburgh, PA, that's right. So, so feel free to drop that in and let us know. Rich, I have folks come from all over, listen around pretty much the U.S., but also we get international every now and then. So as you're coming in, guys, welcome. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to drop a comment in the comment box. I'll be watching those as Rich and I talk, and you can ask questions of both of us. Wanted to let you know, if you've been following the YouTube channel and have missed any YouTube's videos lately, I've put in a couple new ones this week. One was a video that just came out on my favorite genealogy books. And, I already found some more I want to add to that, actually, because, we're genealogists, we love books. And one on analyzing the family Bible. And guys, don't miss, I really had a lot of fun doing one. I guess this was actually last week's. It was how Joanna Gaines, a fixer-upper, made me a better genealogy researcher. So that's a lot of fun to if you got to go listen to that, Rich. It's really
that sounds great.
I loved Fixer-Upper when it was still on the air, and I've been down to Magnolia and the whole bit. So all right, let's see where everybody's from. Hey, Alva's from Texas. Okay, guys, little known fact, Alva and I are actually related. We found out. We're trying to figure out how it actually connects, but we're pretty sure we're cousins there. Hey, Cindy, you're from San Francisco. Donna from Raleigh. Hey, Donna, how are you? Dave is with us again. Dave, you are so faithful. You're here every week. And hey, Jim from Fort Walton Beach, the Florida Panhandle. Okay, funny thing about the Florida Panhandle, I actually went to graduate school in Birmingham, Alabama, and my friend said, let's go to the beach. We're going to the beach this weekend. I'm like, that sounds great. And a little bit later, they referenced our trip to Florida. And I'm like, I thought we were going to the beach, not Florida. And they said, Lisa, what is due south of Birmingham? I'm like, oh. Okay, I grew up in North Carolina. I went east to the Atlantic, not the Gulf. So anyway, that's a fun story about Florida Panhandle.
That is funny.
Oh, yeah. Elna from Kansas City and June. Hey, June from New Hampshire. So we do. We are literally circling the U.S. Okay, guys. So as you can see, I have Rich Venezia sitting, quote unquote, beside me here in our YouTube studio, so to speak. And why did my phone just go off? Anyway, so Rich is of Rich Roots Genealogy, and I met Rich recently on a broadcast we did with Valdelia on genealogy and Italian genealogy research. And I can't believe we haven't met each other actually over the years.
I know, it's weird.
Some of the things we've gone to. But Rich is a specialist in Italian genealogy. Really, he researches 20th century immigrant ancestors, and we were just talking about that. He really specializes in those underutilized resources and federal records, things that we don't necessarily think of as often probably to go after that we would think about. But you also focus on Italian, Irish, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey research.
Yes, so you have
quite a few specialties. And
all stemming from the research that I taught myself to do when I was researching my own family,
Yeah, I think that's how a lot of us get into these kind of subspecialties that we get into. I think that's exactly how we do it. But you also provide people with assistance for dual citizenship applications,
yes,
right?
Yes, for Italy and for Ireland, yeah.
For Italy and Ireland, so it's just the two countries there. Well, I know we probably have a lot of folks doing Irish research in this group too, because I get a lot of questions about Irish research, and I'm not a specialist in that.
It's fun. It's hard. Well, it can be depending upon the time frame.
Yep. So, guys, you may have seen Rich on some of his shows or some of his work, because he's consulted on Follow Your Past, and that's a show on the Travel Channel.
It was on the Travel Channel a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Okay. All right. But you've also, what was the other one you've been on? Genealogy Roadshow.
I worked on the research team of Genealogy Roadshow. Yeah.
So he's definitely, and he speaks at national conferences around. He was at Roots Tech this past February, which barely squeaked in, I guess, under the wire.
Yeah, it sure did.
And so he's here today to talk with us about immigration and immigration with our ancestors and kind of that overview of ship manifest. And we were talking about some of the immigration records that we might not think necessarily to use. So I guess, Rich, one of my first questions would be, when we search, we have that immigrant ancestor, we know who came over, but we need to know more about them. Maybe we need to know where they came from, or we're trying to find that country of origin. What's kind of the first piece of the puzzle that we go for? Do we go for naturalization records? Are we looking at ship manifest records? What's kind of that first step?
So thanks so much for having me, Lisa. I'm really glad to be here. I think that it all really depends upon the time frame. As we talked about a little bit earlier, records relating to immigrants and what records are going to be helpful are really dependent on whether we're talking colonial immigrants or 18th or 19th century immigrants or 20th century immigrants. And really, the more recent the immigrant, the more likely you are to find a lot of good documentation and information about them. The earlier the immigrant, the less likely it is there's going to be really good sources, especially relating to things like their specific immigration. A lot of people don't realize that they actually didn't, there was no specific law in relation to passenger manifests as we think of them, or actually customs lists, until the 1820s. And so anybody that came before 1820, in most instances, if they show up on an arrival list, it's usually almost incidental. Like, it's definitely the exception as opposed to the rule. And don't get me wrong, there's millions and millions of records of people arriving earlier, whether it's a captain's ship log or some other record that specifies their arrival. It wasn't actually national law until 1820 to have lists of people that were arriving into the United States. And even for the better part of the 1800s, up until 1891, it was, those lists that they started creating were actually customs lists. They weren't created to regulate immigrants. They were created to regulate customs, right? Because the government wants their tax. And so
it's all about the money.
It's always about the money, right? That's always why a lot of these records are created. And so because of that, a lot of the early immigration records aren't sexy. You know what I mean? You get a ship manifest, it says a name, age, whether male or female, what their occupation was. And if you're lucky, it'll tell you where they're going in the United States. But a lot of times it just says they're going to the US, or in some cases they're going to Canada, And so it can sometimes be really difficult and really be frustrating for people that are doing early immigrant research, because you'll find, an 1837 customs list for an Anne Murphy, right? But you probably will never actually be able to determine with certainty if that specific list relates to your specific person, unless you have other documentation or the people that were traveling with that person match up your family exactly, that kind of thing. Just because the records that were created at that time were often not super, they often don't contain a lot of the things that we would find genealogically helpful.
Gotcha. So, and some of those like early things, more the custom type list as opposed to the immigration.
Right.
Are they even online, or where do you typically see those? I'm just curious.
So the very early lists that are pre-1820 are, there was a fellow called P. William Philby, and he created, I think it was like a 15 or 20 or 30 volume series of, I want to say, over 4,000 different sources of places where he sourced early immigrant arrivals from. And that list is on some of the big websites, definitely on Ancestry. And it's kind of, you might have to search around a bit to find it. Because it's not called like P. William Philby's list of early immigrants, right? But it's like an index to early American arrival records. And that, can be found on Ancestry and some of these other places, also in books. So once libraries are opened up again, a lot of big genealogy libraries, certainly the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, the Midwest Genealogy Library, Fort Wayne, Allen County Public Library, like all of those should have the full set of Philby's records, but they are also digitized online. It usually tells you the name of the person and then also where he found that. So then you can go and get the original wherever that may be, whether it's online or at a library somewhere, something like that. And then the records from 1820 to the 1890s, which are the customs lists, which when they started to federally mandate these types of records to be created, those are also on the big players, Ancestry, Family Search. I think MyHeritage should have them. Find My Past probably has them. And so a lot of those early lists should be on a lot of these websites. The New York ones are on the Ellis Island website. And so there's a lot of different places that you can look for these early lists.
Well, that's good to know. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't aware of quite some of those early ones, especially. You hear more about those later ones and places to find those. And that's usually what shows up first when you're doing your searches.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Definitely. But so one of the things I kind of wanted to ask you, because since you do so much of this, is I get questions sometimes about ships manifest. And we've just talked about that, but a lot of times people are like, well, it says they have them, but I guess my question is, did they all survive? And how many, do we know how many of those survived coming over? Or early on, I'm assuming they probably didn't as much.
So again, it all depends upon the time frame. For the most part, most manifests should survive. Okay. I think a more appropriate question might be, should everyone be on the list? And the answer to that is it's unclear. So there are a lot of folks, I've researched a lot of British Isles, English and Irish immigrants in the 1870s, 1880s, 1850s, 60s that I don't find. And it's not even that I find, 5 Bridget Murphys and I can't figure out which one is mine. A lot of times I don't find them. And sometimes it's unclear whether, some of the first and second class cabin passengers, especially as we started to see on steamships, if they were inspected, if they were listed on the list and that kind of thing. There are specific periods of time in which manifests don't survive as well. And so there's a specifically late 1890s, early 1900s, some of those first and second class cabin manifests either don't survive or were never created in the first place, as well as in the early 1900s, it's known that a couple of years of New Orleans passenger lists don't survive. And so it's really hard to generalize too much about that, because in some ports they should survive from beginning to end, right? And in other ports there's sometimes pockets missing, or they may survive but they're only on microfilm. They're not yet online, or they're online but they're not yet indexed. Gotcha. And so that can sometimes be really difficult, especially if you're an earlier beginning researcher, because you want to be able to access a lot of those things from home with some ease. And sometimes it's just, that's not the case. You have to kind of do some deep digging to figure that out. And that's actually sometimes where some of these later things like naturalization records could come in handy, or alien registration records, because sometimes those cross-reference the ship manifests. And so it can actually lead you to a manifest that perhaps otherwise you might have had difficulty finding.
And it never occurred to me that, the lower class passenger may not have even had appeared or been put on a list. I hadn't thought about that.
It's usually the higher class passenger.
The higher class. Oh, okay.
Steerage, usually you should always find.
See how much I know about ships. But, I'm not really a water person here.
But also, for instance, too, I think something that's important to remember is that, these websites where we do research, a lot of times they created their own index, and a lot of times those indexes were created in, they were often created by folks that speak English as a second language, or even as a third or fourth language. And so sometimes the transcriptions of the records are really difficult, A, perhaps because of a language issue, but B, it also could be because the manifest was damaged or destroyed, and so it's hard to read. There's water damage. And it also could be that, I can read lots of Italian names, but I might have difficulty reading Eastern European names or Slavic names or, things like that. And so there's a lot of limitations in terms of the records that are available online, in the sense of, we expect that we can go on to a database, search in a name, and if it's not there, it's not there, right? Mm-hmm. And that's really only the case maybe like half the time, because it could be that the name is just very poorly transcribed, or the woman you're looking for is actually traveling under her maiden name, mm-hmm. or they were a stowaway, or that specific manifest for that specific year doesn't survive, or half the manifest is damaged, and so the only column that survives is first name and not last name. And so you need to find another document that tells you your person was on that list, so you can then determine, that, Donato is my Donato because I have this other record that says he arrived on this ship.
Gotcha.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that we take for granted, there's all these records online, right? And you search mm-hmm. and you search and you search, and you don't find it. When in fact, it could be that there's other limitations there, and there's a lot of other records that you might be able to search for that aren't as readily accessible online, that you'll have to, browse on Family Search. You'll have to go to a family history center, mm-hmm. or, go do some research at the National Archives, for instance, into some of the microfilm or some of the physical records to find some records that we think are actually online, but perhaps, for one reason or another, are badly indexed.
Right. Well, so let's talk a little bit about, you had kind of alluded to earlier before we started talking about the naturalization records that are kind of beyond just the naturalization records we might find online, or that, once you kind of get the naturalization papers or the citizenship papers, but you said there's some other things out there that have a lot of good information in it that we may be missing.
Yeah. So, a lot of people will find a manifest, they'll find a naturalization record, especially when they're doing 20th century immigration research or sort of late 1800s research. And they'll stop there, right? They'll think, all right, well, I've got the manifest, I've got the nats, cool, we're good to go. But in fact, at various timeframes throughout the history of the country, starting as early as the 1790s, actually aliens were required to register with the government. And so, for instance, in the late 1700s to the late 1820s, there was an alien registration requirement. And so newly arriving aliens actually had to register with, it was usually the local clerk of court, to say, hi, I'm from this place, I'm intending to make my residence in wherever. And unfortunately, like 99% of those records don't survive. But on naturalization records on a certain time frame from 1816 to 1828, they had to include that alien registration information. So a lot of people think early naturalization records usually aren't helpful. And most of the time they're right. But if your person happened to naturalize in this time frame from 1816 to 1828, included in their paperwork should be alien registration records. But you might have to click a little forward, click a little backward, or it could be that they're not in the digitized version of the record, but they might be microfilmed or something somewhere else. And likewise, as we go into the 1900s, and especially the 1910s during World War I and the 1940s at the outset, right before and then during World War II, the government was really interested in keeping track of their alien population. Specifically in World War I, they were interested in enemy aliens. So that's Germans and Austro-Hungarians. And in World War II, the enemy aliens were the Italians, Germans, and Japanese. And so there's a lot of alien registration paperwork. Some of it was federal and some of it was statewide. So it depends on the time frame and the ethnicity. But there's a lot of these records that still exist, but a lot of them don't necessarily show up in these big search engines in Ancestry, Family Search, and things like that. Or if they're there, you can only browse through them and you can't do like an OCR index search. But if you know to look for them, you can either go to that specific collection, or, for instance, if you know you had an alien in Minnesota in 1918, for instance, there's this statewide alien registration, and those records are held at this archives in Minnesota. But you might not necessarily know to go look into that index that's on this random archives in Minnesota's website, unless there was an alien registration in Minnesota in 1918 for all aliens. you might not know to write to USCIS for the 1940 alien registration forms. Because if you didn't know that they're there, and there's no reference to those forms elsewhere, you might be missing some really good information that could include information about hometown or ship arrival or things like that.
So would it be, so if you suspect you have, say, an immigrant ancestor, and that there might be, and you don't know if they're alien registration type things, would the best thing to do is really contact like your archives or really, and find somebody to ask? Is that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, you could, there is some literature written about them. Unfortunately, there isn't really a good comprehensive kind of list of alien registrations, because not too many people have done a lot of research into them, or there's been a lot of disparate research into this specific one or that specific one, but no one's really put all the like ones together.
I guess I was thinking more along terms of like at the state level. So for instance, I research in North Carolina, and I have one little immigrant ancestor, and she's a brick wall. But anyway, I have no idea. But well, if it had been a male, I think he would have been naturalized. But anyway, if I didn't know, would I then just talk to the archivist at like the archives and say, hey, I've got this immigrant line. They seem to have landed here. Would there be anything? Is that kind of the best way to approach that, to find out what's there?
Yeah, I would say, reach out to the state archives, but also don't neglect the National Archives that has jurisdiction over the state of interest for your research. Because it could be, like, for instance, in North Carolina, there was a statewide alien registration started in 1927 that went up to 1940. All those records are on the North Carolina State Archives website. I know that because I've done research into that, but a lot of folks might not. If you research into the state archive, if you reach out to the state archives, they should be able to say, oh yeah, in fact, here's the link to it. They've all been digitized. Let us know if you have any questions. But it could also be that if there is an alien registration that was conducted on a federal level, like for instance, I'm thinking these World War I enemy alien registrations, most of the ones that survive are now in National Archives because it was a federal registration, even though only certain states' records still exist. So if you contacted the North Carolina State Archives, they might not know about that. But if you contacted the National Archives in Atlanta, which has jurisdiction over North Carolina, they might say, oh yeah, we've got, alien registrations from World War I for, I know there's one in Kentucky, and I think part of, I don't know if there's one in the Carolinas, I can't remember. But so make sure that you contact a couple of different archives, both like a regional one as well as a statewide one, to ascertain if there's any of that type of information available.
I mean, that is a really great point, is looking at the state level, and certainly going to that federal level as well, since they do exist on both levels.
Yeah, indeed.
So that's a really good a good thing. In fact, I made a note to myself to make sure I check that for that kind of thing. So yeah. All right, let me pop over to the group and see, because I see little comments popping up that I don't know if you can see these or not, Rick. Can you see them?
I can, yeah.
Oh, okay. So Kathy's from Ohio and Barbara's from New Jersey. Don is sitting somewhere close to you, apparently, in Pittsburgh.
Hello, Don.
Regina, you've got a fan. Regina saw you at Roots Tech.
Thanks, Regina.
Yes, and we have Linda from Arlington. So guys, if you have a question, go ahead and drop it into the comment box. Oh, I want to, before I forget, Rich, and we'll talk a little bit more, I want to put in Rich's website into the to the chat box. And if you are listening to this on replay, I will have it in the description below, because I know that for some reason you're not able to see the comments or all of the comments when we do this live. I'm really not sure why that happens, but it does. So let me pop that in there. Yeah, you definitely want to check out Rich's site. Okay, so Regina said, what is the best way to research immigrants before 1855?
That's hard. So I guess it really depends on what you want to know. If you're, trying to find a manifest, a customs list, if they immigrated after 1820, You might find one, you might not. You might find a bunch of people that have the same name, and it might be really difficult for you to determine if they are your person of interest or not. If the question is, I need to find out my place of origin for, like I need to figure out where in Ireland my family's from, right? Because for instance, in Ireland, like you can't do research on a national level at that time frame. You have to know exactly where in Ireland they came from. And so that's where you really want to start digging into all the different types of records that exist that might give us a place of origin. So you want to look into county histories. You want to look into church records, especially if they were Catholic. It could be that marriage records or baptismal records of their kids might list their place of origin. You want to look into all the vital records for all the family that came over, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever. You want to look into deeds, for instance. It's unlikely, but I've seen sometimes place of origin information listed in deeds. You definitely want to look into wills, to estate files, to things like that. If we're getting more towards the late 1800s, there might also be some other records that could exist that could be more helpful. But in the earlier records, you really just want to do good genealogical research and finding all the different types of records that you'd find, for families that have been in America for generations. You want to look into the wills, you want to look into the church records, you want to look into the deeds, you want to look into the county histories, you want to look into the tax rolls, all the different types of records, because you never know where there might be a notation that says, oh, this person came from X place. And cemetery records, for instance, you want to look at the gravestone. A lot of times, early immigrants, if they wind up having enough money to have a memorial, they might list on there, the folks that erected the memorial might say native of, this parish in Ireland or something like that. And you want to look into their friends, associates, and neighbors. You want to look into the people that they surround themselves with. Because if somebody with the same name, the same last name, winds up as the executor on the will and the godparent of the children and things like that, it might be that they're not related, but it could be that they're the sibling or the cousin or something like that. And maybe you exhaust all the research that you can for your family of interest. But if you find other people that could be related or that you theorize could have migrated to the United States with those people, you might do the same type of research into those families and other families until you find, oh, this whole town of blank immigrated from this place in Ireland to this place in Virginia, but it's only until, of course, it'll be like the 10th family that you research where you finally find that information that you want.
Yeah. Well, you were speaking my story when you talk about county histories, because that's something I talk a lot about, and understanding the social history and the area where somebody lived, because you do find whole towns that came over, and you can find out migration patterns using those county histories and things. So yeah, absolutely. All right, so you can see these questions coming in, I know, over there. So let's see. I'm actually going to read them because the replay doesn't always, they won't be able to see the comments. But so Dave says he has an ancestor that came from Ireland around 1810 to New York, and in 1813 was in New Jersey. In 1816, Ontario. Where would he find more information?
So that's a tough time frame, especially from Ireland. I would say the same types of resources that I was just talking about for Regina's question in terms of, doing really good, deep genealogical research into, the different places that he was living, wills, deeds, tax records, church records, looking into who he was associating with. And that's tough, going from New York to New Jersey to Ontario, there's a lot of migration there. And so you also could do some sociological or historical research to see, were there a lot of people from, whatever county he was living in New Jersey up in Ontario in the late, 18 teens. And is there something behind that? Was he following a job? Could there be other types of records associated with that migration? And that's going to be really dependent on a case-by-case scenario.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And Carol said, would family members traveling on the same ship always be listed together on the manifest? Good question.
They should be in theory, but not always. Some of the later manifests, especially once you hit the early 1900s, they actually might list, they might annotate the manifest and say like, oh, wife of, number 17. Or if like it's two older kids and their parents that are coming over, if the parents are listed separately from the children, they might notate on there, like, child of, previous page, let's say we're on page 20, right? Child of page 16, lines, 7 and 8 or something like that. Mm-hmm. More often than not, you'll find families listed together. But you can't say with certainty 100% all the time that they are, especially too later on in the 1900s, we see if one family member has naturalized, but other family members haven't, it could be that the naturalized family member is listed on manifest of U.S. citizens, and the other family members are listed on the manifest of aliens. And so you don't necessarily always know that they're even on the same manifest. And that's something that I found a lot in terms of folks kind of going back to the old country and bringing over siblings or parents or things like that. You actually have to really look at the whole manifest to see, are there other people of interest on here? Because otherwise you might say, well, his parents came over. But if you haven't also looked for him on that same ship, you might not realize, it was actually he going back to, the old country. And now that he's a citizen, more able to bring his parents over or something like that.
I never really thought about people going over to bring somebody back, or going back over to bring somebody forward. I mean, I know people kind of follow the same route, but you can see I don't do a lot of this research.
Well, I would know nothing about any sort of early 1700s, especially North Carolina.
Let's talk colonial North Carolina. All right. So Jim had a question. He said he has 2 Irish female relatives who lived in Washington, D.C. Whoa, it flipped. Washington, D.C. that stated they were naturalized prior to 1910. The 1910 federal census, but he can't find the records.
So there's 2 thoughts I have there. One is that Washington, D.C. is a funky jurisdiction in that, a lot of times you're going to want to go to the county court to see if there's naturalization records. But D.C. is its own sort of federal jurisdiction because it's not a state, right? And so there's something funky that goes on with Washington, D.C. naturalization records, and I can't remember exactly what it is. But if you Google like National Archives, Washington, D.C. naturalization records, there is an article on the National Archives website that lays out the different idiosyncrasies about doing research in the District of Columbia's Nats records. But also something that Jim didn't mention, and so I don't know if these ladies were married or not, but something to keep in mind as well is that you don't always find wives and minor children of folks listed on naturalization records, because up to a certain time frame, women received citizenship automatically when their husband became a citizen. Or if an alien woman came over and married a U.S.-born, native man, she just became a citizen automatically because that was the law at that time. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to generalize about that because the laws changed so much. But the 1855 to 1922 is sort of the broad time frame of when women would automatically become citizens based on their husband's citizenship status. And so it could be that, your people of interest were married to a citizen and are not listed on any naturalization paperwork anywhere because just according to the law at the time, they were automatically seen as citizens. And before 1906, when the federal government took over the process of naturalization, the forms weren't standardized. So it very likely, the record might not even say if the man was married, but it could be that he was married and had 4 foreign-born kids, and they all became citizens when he took the oath of allegiance, but it's not necessarily listed anywhere on that document because there was just, no information that was necessary at that time to be required to keep about the other people that became citizens when a male individual naturalized.
Interesting. So when if during that time period, if people came, if the father was naturalized and say he had a wife and children, minor children, coming forward, would the minor children ever have to prove their naturalization? Was there ever any reason at that point, come and say in the early 1900s, if they were already here, was there a need?
It depends, especially when we come to the outbreak of World War I, and if, let's say, the son wanted to serve in the army. If the father was German, for instance, the government was very interested in knowing, like, are you a German citizen or not, right? Because they wanted to make sure they were loyal to the U.S. and not to, their former country. For the most part, usually you could utilize like a birth record, a baptismal record, and the father's naturalization record to prove citizenship for something like voting or serving on a jury or something else that only citizens can do. But for the most part, there wasn't any like one big national event that required a whole bunch of people to, get their own naturalization paperwork. Right. Usually it was, sufficient to, to provide this. I'm stating, this record says I'm this person's child and this is this person's naturalization record. Therefore, I can be seen as a citizen. But we see that change later in the century as we get things like Social Security, and there's more rights granted to citizens. We do see more things where women and children who had become citizens by virtue of a father or a husband can apply for their own paperwork, but it was generally never a requirement. And that also changed in the 1940s and 50s in terms of like young kids. You'll see like parents naturalizing their like 4-year-old child, but because they changed the laws, and so therefore the parents then had to also take out naturalization papers for their minor children as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was just thinking it might be a way to backdoor into somebody's naturalization papers if a child had an adult child had to prove that.
Yeah,
thinking was going on that, but yeah,
it's definitely possible, but not super likely, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right. So Donna has a question. She said her second great grandfather immigrated from Ireland to Cleveland, Ohio in 1872. She found a voter registration, and in 1910 he was naturalized, but she can't find his naturalization. Any recommendations or any suggestions?
I'm not too familiar with Cuyahoga County, which is where Cleveland is located, but I can say that before 1906, there were very different laws and regulations around naturalization. And so it could be that several different courts naturalized aliens in Cleveland at that time. I can't say this with certainty because I'm not super familiar with Cuyahoga County, like I said. But for instance, Philadelphia, before 1906, there were 11 different courts that naturalized citizens in different timeframes. And so it could be that only 3 or 5 or 7 of those 11 courts records have been put online. And so depending upon the time frame, you might have to look in a bunch of different places, even though you go online and it says, oh, here's Cleveland naturalization records. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I would reach out to, and this really goes for anybody that's in this predicament, I would reach out to the local either genealogy society or the county library or any sort of local library that has a genealogy section or, genealogy research service maybe, and ask them, in what court did people at this time frame go to naturalize? In this instance, Cleveland between 1872 and 1910, right? Or in your case, if you have the voter registration, whatever the year of the voter registration was. And then ask, okay, how do I get a search of those records? Are they online? Are they not online? Are only some of them online? And this is where looking at sources are really important. You can go on Ancestry and search in the Ohio naturalization records, right? And search and not find anything. But unless you go look at exactly what sources are included in that database, it could be that, some of the courts that naturalized in that county at that time aren't included in that database. So you haven't actually searched all of the different possibilities for that time frame. For the most part, people are going to naturalize in the city or in the county in which they live. They were required to. After a certain point, you had to live in the place that you naturalized. But also, depending upon people's jobs, if they were a miner, if they were a traveling laborer, it could be that they go somewhere for a couple of years and, maybe you lose them for a few years. And perhaps when you lose them for a few years, when they've gone, in Pittsburgh, for instance, we got people going to West Virginia or out to Ohio or something. It could be in the years that they worked in that other place. That's when they naturalized. And so you've also got to, consider if they lived in any other places other than the place in which you're searching.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. All right. So, guys, we are going to wrap this up, but I have a question for Rich. I need help on. So
here we go. Here we go.
Okay. So the oral history on multiple sides of the family. The Irish grandmother came over. This would have been around 1850. Okay. and probably landed around DC, Baltimore area, based on some other research I did. The story is she was married and her husband died aboard the ship coming over. Mm-hmm. So my question is, if an ancestor was coming over and died aboard a ship, are there records for that?
So actually, the 1820 customs lists, so that started in 1820, that go to the late, the early 1890s. There's only like 5 or 6 columns on there. It's name, age, sex, occupation, country to which you belong, so your nationality, and country to where you're going. But there's also a column for if you died on the ship. So if you find them on a manifest, it should, right, be noted that the individual died on the passage. Okay. I don't necessarily know of any other documentation, especially that early, where you're going to get any further details, in shipping records or, anything like that. But if you do find them on a customs list, it should be listed if the individual died or not. And I've heard a lot of family stories about that, like, oh, they died on the ship, when in fact, it's later been figured out that it was part of the journey, but not necessarily the ship itself, right? It could have been from their hometown to the port of departure, or it could have been if they went from Ireland to Liverpool first. If they got off in Liverpool, could have died there, right. Or if they got to New York, or you said Baltimore, and let's say then went to Ohio, it could have been anywhere between Baltimore and Ohio, right, between their destination. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. Not just in your story, but in any sort of family story like that. Sometimes the story, the idea of what happened gets blended together, and it's, oh, they died on the voyage. But keep in mind that the voyage could have been anywhere up from 2 weeks or 3 weeks prior to actually getting on the ship to 2 weeks or 3 weeks after getting off the ship, depending upon where they come from and where they're going. So it could also be that it could have occurred along the way somewhere.
Yeah, and I'm not even, this is oral history, as we know, and I'm not even convinced she actually had a husband, but everybody seems to think. So the story goes on that he died and that she put him in a pickle barrel to get him all the way across the ocean. I'm not like going, okay, there you lost me on the story, people. I'm like, I think but I had wondered, I was like, what?
It sounds like an amazing story. You never know, right? Who knows? And if that's the case, he's probably not listed as having died on the ship. Right?
Probably not, because he's in a pickle barrel. No, but actually, I was speaking, actually right back at the early March, just before everything shut down, to a group, and a woman came up to me afterwards, and this was here in North Carolina. She goes, I need to talk to you because I had presented my Joanna Barrett as my brick wall person. She says, I know her. I know about her. And I think I have a picture of her. And I just about fell over. I'm like, you're kidding me. So we've been able, she's the one who told me about the pickle barrel story. I had heard much of the story, but not that part of it. But her uncle knew her. And so his mother, I guess, knew her. But anyway, he had all the stories about her.
But they weren't related? He just knew her?
No, he was like a great nephew or something like that.
Okay. So you are related somehow.
And we're definitely related, but it was just so, nobody's heard of this woman. But anyway, apparently she went to church on Sundays and could cuss like a sailor. So she apparently, whatever. But anyway, it's all the fun things. So, all right, let me just make sure there's nothing else that came up here. Kathy said she had records to begin were under the Common Pleas Court in Ohio. Okay, that was in reference to that other. She's answering Donnas.
Yeah.
Kathy,
thanks for that, Kathy.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Appreciate that. All right, guys, thank you so much. Thank you, Rich, for coming and talking with us. This has been so helpful.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Anytime you want to come talk, I know you have lots of specialties too. Anytime you want to chat, we'll be glad to. Donna says something about, she said there's someone buried in Beaufort, North Carolina, that died at sea and they put him in a whiskey barrel. Donna, I have heard that story. And that is, for you guys out there, that is Beaufort, not North Carolina, not Beaufort, South Carolina. They're two different things. Yes, Donna, I have heard that story. Absolutely. I'm going to check that one out. Yeah. So who knows? Maybe it'll be a whiskey barrel, but pickled him anyway. So anyway, well, thanks so much, Rich. I really appreciate you taking time to chat. I know that everybody, I'm sure, got a lot out of that. And
any other questions come up, you know, my website's in the comments and is going to be in the description. So feel free to shoot me an email. I'll be happy to answer any other questions that come up.
Yep. All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lisa.
You're welcome. I'll see you guys next week.